Hey buddy, what's up? It's Monday. Today we're going to be talking about the East African Squadron. Now, in case you don't know, and I assume you don't because I didn't know until recently, the East Africa Squadron was a Royal Navy task force that was sent to the east coast of Africa in the 1807 in order to slow down or ideally prevent the slave trade. Now, at this point, it's important to note that Britain wasn't trying to stop slavery worldwide. They're just trying to prevent the slave trade. Um, Britain actually outlawed slavery in the home islands back in 1104. But their whole mentality was that although slavery is repulsive, they might not have control over what every single country does within its borders. But at the time, the British Navy kind of ruled the whole world. Like no country could really afford to go to war with the British Navy. In fact, in a lot of cases, um, groups of countries couldn't afford to go to war with the British Navy. So they decided to do this, and this is how they executed it. So in the early 1800s, the British Admiralty, for whatever reason, decided that they were going to stop slavery, and they sent two ships to go fight it. Now, this is interesting because at the time, slavery wasn't exactly as repulsive as it is now. An interesting thing is that although slavery was illegal in mainland Britain, some people would use certain arguments in order to try to kind of get around the law and own slaves. And one of them was that as long as they weren't made slaves in Britain, like for example, if they're captured somewhere else and enslaved there and then transported to Britain, then they weren't made slaves in Britain, hence not outside the law. And a British judge said one of the most beautiful things I ever heard from a judicial appointee, and I don't remember the exact quote, but was basically that slavery is such a horrendous crime that the only way it can be legal in any way, shape, or form is if a positive law allows it. Meaning that it's one of those things that by default is wrong. So the only way that would be allowed in the British Isles isn't if you get around the law, it's that if a law explicitly says it's okay, which obviously it didn't. Okay, year's 1807. The British military sends two ships down to the West Africa. So the year is 1807, the British Admiralty sent two ships down to the east coast of Africa. Their job is to stop or slow slavery. Now, originally they did this by stopping ships, and if they had slaves on board, everybody would get fined. The owner would get fined and whatever. And this created an unintentional consequence where the owners of the ship, or the captains of the ship, when they see a British warship on the horizon, would start throwing slaves overboard to lower the amount they're fined. And it was really horrible, and so it didn't get off to a great start. But then in 1811, they changed the law around, and then it was called the Felony Slave Act, and this is kind of what helped everything. Meaning, if you just had, let's say your ship and you didn't have any slaves on board, but you still had like the chains and you're suspected of slavery, either transporting or whatever, then that's when you'd get charged and you'd get in trouble for it. So not only would they hold the captain and crew, but then the owners and the insurance companies that own the ship would all get in trouble. So that's when real consequences started to come down. Now, I don't know if you heard about the triangular trade, where slaves would go to the United States, raw materials would be loaded onto the ships and taken to Britain in order to be made into manufactured goods, and then those manufactured goods would be then shipped to Africa to be sold and to be turned to slaves. So it was this like weird pattern. So a lot of these ships did involve the Americas. So in 1811, this was a problem, and the British boarding American ships, slavery or not, was part of the reason that the U.S. decided to go to war with Britain in the War of 1812, just a year later. Now, the British were at war with the United States, so they didn't have any problem boarding any type of ship. So they would just go on and search whatever. And yeah, man, real consequences for people who were caught in the slave trade. So this is about when the Napoleonic Wars were starting, and Britain kind of found itself at war with pretty much everybody. So one of the tricks that the slavers would do is they try to change their flag so that like the British might not have a problem boarding an American ship, but they might have a problem boarding like a Dutch or a French ship. Well, all of a sudden, Britain found themselves at war with everybody, so they would board everybody regardless of whether they're a ship, whether they were suspected of slavery or not, and the ones that were dealt with accordingly. And then after that, Britain passed a law that pretty much treated slavers the same as pirates, which meant super hard, like automatic hangings and stuff like that. So eventually, even though slavery was still legal in the United States decided to also participate in the anti-slave patrols. I don't know if you realize this or not, but according to my research, and I could be wrong, I'm not a historian on the subject, but it seems like slavery, the transport of slaves, stopped a lot earlier than slavery itself did in the United States. Because the United States actually sent ships to go help with the anti-slavery patrols later on in this task force's time. So an interesting little side note for this whole thing, there was a ship called the HMS Black Joke, which I guess could be a little racially insensitive, but it was a ship, and legend has it, it was a slave ship that was boarded and released, and the slaves were released, and the British took it over and started using it because it was fast. And they asked any of the slaves if they wanted to work on the ship and help deal with some of these other slave things. And about half the crew volunteered to actually help crew the ship. And so they named it the Black Joke, and it was the fastest anti-slave ship there, which was a former slave ship. And I thought that was just an amazing little fact. So soon after that, a lot of these officers found it more difficult to go and find some of these slave ships. They're just getting faster, they're getting smaller, more versatile, and they're becoming harder to find. So the British officers kind of went against orders, and they started sending raiding parties ashore to destroy these camps or these markets for slaves. Now, what's interesting about this is that these were not British colonies. These were French, they were Prussian, they were Dutch. These were foreign country colonies that these British officers decided, you know what, we're going to go do it. And because they were so far away from London, and because this was the 1800s, it took months for London to find out that the British officers did this, then months to get a reply, and then the officers would always respond, so months back. So you're talking about them doing something, then a year later there might be a punishment for it. It got so bad that one of the captains got relieved and had to go up to London. And then he went to London and he spoke to Parliament, and not only did he not get in trouble, but then he convinced Parliament to change the laws to support what he was doing. So that's when Britain pretty much decided, we're ending slavery once and for all. So the total amount of ships down there was 25. It started at 2, it ended up being 25. And the British started landing ashore, they started burning down these markets and stuff, and then they started hunting kings or like chiefs of different tribes, and either persuading them to stop or just outright killing them. Britain decided one day they were not going to allow the world to have slavery anymore. And these are the actions they took. In the end, they stopped 1,600 slave ships, resulting in a total amount of slaves freed 150,000. 150,000 less slaves came to the United States, or to be honest, pretty much the United States, because of the British military. One of the captains wrote a really eloquent quote, and I wish I wrote it down, but I didn't. And it basically said that in the history of the English Empire, they only did 3 or 4 total righteous things. And the actions they did against slavery was one of them. Basically, the British government decided one day that slavery is done worldwide. They had the capability and resources to end it, and they did. And honestly, I think it's a story that should be told more, because although there's a lot of stories involving slavery that we all need to know, I feel like this one's particularly interesting because in this particular case, it didn't affect Britain. They just decided it was a moral thing to do, and they would go out and do it, regardless of if it pissed off the rest of the world and their allies or not, and it even contributed to wars with them, and they still steadfast and finished the job. So I just thought you'd enjoy that story. Anyway, buddy, I love you, I miss you, I'm proud of you, and stay awesome.